to Jeff Lamondia, and he will start the presentation on the role of alternative transportation systems in national parks and federal lands for enhancing visitor experiences and preserving resources. Jeff?
Great. Thank you so much, Amber. Welcome to everyone. I'm glad you could be here, and I'm thrilled to be giving this webinar with you all today. As Amber said, my name is Jeff Lamondia. I'm an assistant professor at Auburn University, and my background is in transportation and transportation planning, with my emphasis is on leisure travel, looking at leisure behavior, and I'm specifically interested in accessibility issues for alternative forms of transportation using buses, walking, and biking. So this whole webinar is close to my heart, I guess you'd say. Okay, so the title of our webinar today is The Role of Alternative Transportation Systems in National Park and Federal Lands for Enhancing Visitor Experiences and Preserving Resources. Now that's quite long, but the real main points we want to take away from today are based on how we can use alternative transportation systems in a number of different areas for enhancing visitor experiences and making sure that at the same time we are preserving resources for the different areas. Okay, so the goals for today are first that we would like to introduce some of the major issues and concerns associated with federal lands, all these different areas that we're going to talk about today. Next, we're going to describe how these concerns affect visitors' experiences and the natural and cultural resources in these different areas. We are then going to outline the different alternative transportation system options that we have available that managers could use in their different areas. And finally, we're going to wrap things up by providing a framework for evaluating alternative transportation systems, and hopefully overall you will be prepared for the entire series of TAC training modules that we are offering. And I just want to say that the format of the webinar today is first to present information, to share information with you, but as we said, we want this to be interactive, so if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to use the Q&A to let us know, or we'll have certain moments in time where we stop and open the floor for large questions, so we'll take care of that as well. And we'll also be including a number of polls along the way, similar to what we did with looking at where we are and how many people are in your group. We'll try and gauge some ideas of what you're all thinking about specific topics and make sure that we're all on the same page and thinking things the same way. So the agenda, in order to reach all those goals, is to first start by looking at those critical concerns and talk about the support we have for alternative transportation systems. And then from there, we're going to move into talking about how those concerns impact natural resources, visitor behavior, and visitor experiences, and how we can manage those things using the alternative transportation system opportunities. And we'll detail how those work, some major characteristics of each of those, and how they can be used to improve our federal lands. And finally, we'll conclude everything with talking about a framework for those systems.
And I'll just jump in here for those of you who joined us late. There is a button on the top right-hand corner of your screen that reads feedback. If you're having any issues connecting or having any problems, simply change your feedback button at this point, and someone will open up an instant chat window with you to provide you some assistance. Don't close the window until we've actually solved any kind of problems that you have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So we are breaking the webinar into a number of sections simply to make sure we are all thinking along the same lines and make it easier to follow as we go along. So the first section that we're going to talk about are those critical concerns. What are we really worried about in federal lands, and why do we even care about the role of alternative transportation systems? Well, one of the major uses of national parks and federal lands in general is recreation. A lot of visitors come there to do activities, outdoor recreation activities. And in general, federal lands are considered a multi-billion-dollar asset to the United States, and they include about a third of all U.S. lands, which is a considerable amount of land. And they're also operated by a number of federal land management agencies. A number of you are representing each of these agencies with us today. And as I said, they are not only a historically popular outdoor recreation destination, but the numbers of people visiting each year just keeps increasing. And you can see that the Forest Service has over 173 million recreation visitors last year, and the National Park Service had over 275 million visitors. And so each organization, each type of federal land has their own kind of mandate or operating procedure of what their goals are. And I wanted to highlight, this is just one example from the National Park Service, and what they find important is promoting and regulating national parks and trying to encourage people to come visit them, while at the same time conserving scenery and the natural and historic objects, and making sure that they're leaving them unimpaired for future generations. So it's kind of this balance between we want to make sure lots of people can get in today and enjoy it today, but we want to preserve things for today and for the future. And in doing so, they actually have many uses that people come. Some of them are protected, some of them are more developed for different types of personal use. And over the past number of decades, in order to allow more people to visit and experience these great areas, we've seen a real emphasis on personal vehicles and improved access to these areas using cars and campers and motorcycles and trucks and all these things. And it's resulted in two big trends that we see in federal lands. The first is a management culture that's really focused on having everyone have access with their private automobile. And the second one is kind of subsequent to that, that we are developing these areas with an auto-oriented infrastructure. So everything's kind of built around cars, and it's great that we can provide access to people. And so the real emphasis has been on that in the past number of years. So it's kind of culminated in this extensive national park infrastructure, and I'm just using this as an example from the national parks, but this applies, of course, to all federal lands, where we have numbers and numbers of miles of roadways and parkways, extensive bridges that have been built, miles of trails, bicycle paths, waterways, and of course, we're going to talk much more about alternative transportation systems, but there are already 63 transit systems in the national parks, and this includes everything from single vehicles to complete shuttle fleets. Unfortunately, despite all of this design and improvements for the personal autos, this has kind of ended with demand exceeding capacity. And you can see here with these pictures of what it's like sometimes visiting these areas, especially on holidays or summer weekends where federal lands just experience so much demand. And people can be caught in traffic jams for most of the day, which can ruin their experience, and we'll talk more about how that impacts what happens in the parks. So we really have this growing challenge of balancing the demand. So as we saw in the kind of statement for federal lands, that we want to provide visitor enjoyment at the same time as conserving those natural and historical components that make it unique and make it what it is. And unfortunately, these things don't really work together. They're kind of opposite each other. Having people in there is going to have detriment to your natural and historical characteristics. And visitors are oftentimes unaware of how much impact they have on the environment and how much they have on the different structures that are there. And unfortunately, we just can't keep building more auto-oriented infrastructure. We can only build so much before we start really encroaching on the natural environment. So we kind of need to come up with some innovative solutions, and one of those would be alternative transportation systems, which we're talking about today. So among alternative transportation systems, we have a number of options that we could consider, and all of these are considered by management in public and federal lands. So we have options of just keep building auto-based infrastructure. We could just start throwing in alternative modes of transportation. We could limit the number of visitors who come in. That would surely reduce the number of impacts we have. We could restrict where visitors can go and what activities they can participate in. If we limit what's going on, we're going to reduce our impacts. Or we just could create a zoo or theme park-like environment, so where people are kind of shuttled around to specific spots that they can look and see and do things, but that's about it. And what I consider, and I think what the growing consensus is that we need to provide some area-specific solutions that are sensitive to both visitors and the natural environment. And alternative transportation systems are one big option that we see being put ahead for these things. And of course, these things are going to vary by location because every place has different visitors and different natural environments. And along those lines, this is a complex issue for a number of reasons. The first is that we have all of these different concerns, and we're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about mobility for the visitors coming to the area, and we're also concerned about the economic impacts, both in the federal lands and the areas surrounding them. Along those lines, we have such a variety of land in our federal land umbrella that we have some places that are extremely remote and other places that are right up against urban centers or within cities, and so each one of them has their own set of concerns and own set of issues that we need to address. And of course, these concerns change during different times of year, where the largest demand is during weekends in the summer and holidays, and so what you do for those days may not be the same for the rest of the year when we have more diminished demand.
All right, so Jeff is actually going to ask us a few questions, and he wanted us to respond by using our Q&A manager. So after Jeff asks this question, if you will go to your Q&A drop-down menu and type in your responses, Jeff will be able to use the Manage tab to see what your responses are, and he'll share them with everyone in the class.
Great. So to kind of get us all on the same page for thinking about the issues that are in federal lands, I know many of you represent different agencies, so I wanted us to share what we were thinking about our concerns for public lands, national parks, federal lands, and from 4 different aspects. So if you were a visitor to federal lands, what would your major concerns be? And if you were an environmentalist, what would they be? So why don't we start with visitors? If you were a visitor to a public land or national park, federal land, what would your major concerns be when you went there? Okay, I'm seeing 2 great answers here. One of them is, as a visitor, we'd be really concerned about congestion and the experience that we had there. Of course, that's both tied very closely together. And then another one, as a visitor, we have parking and accessibility to get around. Of course, we want to make sure that where we can stop and get out and do things is easily accessible to those activities. Those are great answers. So how about an environmentalist? If you're an environmentalist, what would your concerns be about federal lands? Great. I'm seeing a number of very good responses here. One person said that protecting natural resources and wildlife, of course, that's a huge piece for the environmentalist, right? The trash removal is a really interesting idea here, one I hadn't thought of, but is very true. What we bring into the parks, of course, needs to be taken out of federal lands, so we need to deal with that in some way that helps or works with the environment. And we have more ideas here for preserving wildlife. Good. So environmentalists, of course, as the name would imply, are really concerned with the environment and how things impact that. So what about a public land manager? If you were managing, as some of you may be, federal lands, what are your big issues that you're concerned with? Great. Well, I'm seeing some good answers here. And of course, a lot of these things, everyone's talking about how people access the environment, all these things that we saw with visitors. Environmentalists, managers are concerned with making sure they work together smoothly and protect the environment along the same way. So it's kind of, you need to be concerned with all of these things at once and making sure that they all work really smoothly together. So that's good. I'm going to skip this last one about business owners just to save on time so we can keep going. But it's important to recognize that business owners outside the park also have some interest in what goes on inside federal lands or national parks, because people who are coming to visit those areas are passing through them and will be stopping, and there's always economic development outside these areas. Okay, so you hit on a number of these really great concerns, and so I broke the concerns up into three different big kind of topics. The first of which is environmental concerns. And so these, I've listed a number here of protecting land buffers, the fuel consumption inside federal lands, air and solid pollutants that are going to affect the environment, the culture and environment, the character of these things is really important, and finally, damaging infrastructure is also a concern. Another broad category of concerns is mobility, and we talked a lot about this, especially in conjunction with visitors and managing visitors. Visitors are really concerned about congestion at entrances, on the roadways, on the trails, even at destinations. This is a great picture of Old Faithful, and you can see that if there's just too many people there, it kind of takes away from the experience. And also parking is a huge concern for visitors, and crowding and all these things comes in with congestion and parking along those same lines. And the third broad category is economic concerns. So we kind of have the environmental concerns for all of this, making sure that the environment is protected. We have visitor concerns, especially with mobility, but federal lands still have to function and have funding and develop over time, so we have economic concerns as well that are kind of underlying all of this. And operating costs are of course quite large. We have maintenance issues. Funding issues can sometimes come into play, and we need to make sure that what we're doing supports funding ventures. And finally, development. If we want to develop areas or areas developing or outside, we need to make sure that those work in conjunction with how our federal lands are operating. Okay, so kind of underlying all of those three concerns, those three broad categories of concerns, we have this issue of carrying capacity. And I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with this term, but it describes the amount and types of visitor use that can be accommodated in the federal lands while maintaining the desired resource conditions and quality of the visitor experience. And so the idea here is that there's a certain number and type of visitors that can be within a certain area, and we need to make sure that that number stays at a certain level, that we can maintain it, maintain the visitor experiences and the resource conditions. So one of the most commonly used federal land approaches is this idea of indicator-based adaptive management. And this method comes from a couple of different research areas, and one of them being the limits of acceptable change, and the other being visitor experience and resource protection. So we'll talk a little bit more about what this indicator-based adaptive management is. And it's really based on two big things. The first being indicators of quality, and the second being standards of quality. So indicators of quality are measurable, manageable variables that reflect the essence or meaning of management objectives for resources and visitor experiences. So these are things that we can actually quantify and calculate to describe how federal lands are being managed and how they're working. And then we use these indicators of quality to describe standards of quality. And here we decide what minimum acceptable conditions there are for our indicators of quality, and we set those as standards of quality. And of course, with both of these, we're really concerned with the number and types of visitors in the federal lands. And so ultimately, the concerns end up with a number of conclusions. And I'd like to point out 4 of them here. The first one being that the automobile cannot always be the primary mode of transportation. There's lots of things that we're going to have to deal with because a lot of the concerns are based on automobiles. Visitor transit systems are not simply utilitarian in nature, that visitors who are using these alternative transportation systems are not just doing it to get from point A to point B, but it's an experience in and of itself. And then the last 3 on this list of growing visitation requires complex integrated transportation solutions. That's so important that we really need to recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this, that everyone is going to require their own unique solution to this. And then we can look at the along the same lines, we need to make sure that we have a consistent design standard. Even though there may be variations to it, it needs to be consistent so people know what to expect. And finally, while alternative transportation systems seem to be a great option, they're not always the solution. So we need to make sure that we're considering this as part of an entire management style. Okay, so we've finished up our section 1, and I guess if anyone has any questions, this would be a perfect time for us to answer them.
Great. And so before we move on to the second section, if anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to use the Q&A drop-down menu on the top of your screen to type in your question, and we'll moderate it to Jeff. Or if you'd rather, you can press star 8 on your keypad, and we will open up your telephone line, announce your city, and you can ask your question. It looks like we have one typed question already, and so Jeff, I'll moderate that to you.
Okay.
Can you provide some examples of indicators and standards of quality?
Sure. So some of the indicators that we most commonly see are the number of visitors in an area, the number of vehicles in an area, the number of vehicles and people per hour. Those are some of the ones that are coming right off the top of my head for describing this, but they're all used to describe the level of people in an area, and we can sometimes describe it as the perception of crowding in an area too. So they're not just things where we sit up there with a counter, but we can use surveys to collect this information from people as well.
Great. And we have another question. Do you think pricing is a reasonable way to limit use?
Pricing is definitely an option to control the number of people, the number of vehicles, the use of an area, but I don't know that it is a solution in and of itself. I think it would work along with some of these other options that we're talking about, especially the alternative transportation systems. And I know that pricing for these alternative transportation systems can sometimes be a concern. And it turns out that if people see an improved level of congestion and improved access to areas, that pricing for alternative transportation systems to use them is not such a significant factor.
All right, that looks like it's all the questions unless we have any by telephone. And Jeff, I guess we'll move on to section 2.
Okay, great. So we really talked about the concerns that people have in federal lands. And here I wanted to talk about the fact that we do recognize these concerns, and fortunately that there is ongoing support and efforts going on to improve what we see in federal lands, and especially for alternative transportation systems. So people really recognize that transportation systems are key. They're kind of this core element that relates all those different concerns, and we can address those concerns using transportation systems. So first, we want to recognize that transportation systems influence which areas visitors can access, how visitors can access those areas, the number of visitors that can access areas, the impacts of the environment and resources, and ultimately this has a huge role in visitors' experiences and activity participation in and of themselves and to get to these other places. And so the alternative transportation systems play an important component to this land management effort. And as I said, it may not be the only solution, but it is a real crucial one that we need to consider. And by improving efficiency, we can then improve experiences and reduce our resource impacts through transportation. And so ATS, or I guess ATS is what I'll use to describe alternative transportation systems, so I don't have to keep saying that over and over. But ATS has kind of evolved over time, and it's really hit its stride lately. In the 70s, it was pretty tricky in federal lands. We had unpredictable annual funding, competing non-transportation needs for that funding, and we had transportation infrastructure was a really low priority on that funding list. So in the 80s, once we started improving the access to these areas, some federal legislation came through to help assist with these alternative transportation systems. In the 90s, we saw two large federal programs come into play that really supported alternative transportation systems, and lately we have one that has continued that support. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or ICE-T, and I'll also talk about the Transportation Equity Act for the 21st Century, or T21, and finally the Safety Loo we'll discuss in a little bit too. So the first thing that kind of set this all up was the Federal Lands Highway Program, and this kick-started everything by really focusing on that auto-oriented infrastructure in public lands. It introduced the idea of long-range transportation planning in federal lands and outside of it, but it really got us thinking about how to plan for these areas better and what we need to do to plan for today and the future at the same time. So that kind of led us into ICE-T and T21, those two legislation acts that came through in the 90s. The first one, ICE-T, was the first provided the first extensive studies of ATS in parklands, and there was within this legislation an agreement developed between the Departments of Transportation for states and the National Department of Transportation and the Department of the Interior to develop comprehensive and efficient transportation plans and systems for the federal land and the surrounding areas. And so at this point, after those studies, a few multimodal initiatives, and when I say multimodal, I'm referring to the idea that it's not just autos or not just buses, but that they work together and work seamlessly together. So maybe bicycles can get on buses at a parking lot and then go to a destination, get off, ride around, and then get back on a bus to go somewhere else. So those types of ideas were first starting to come into play during ICE-T. In T21, the Alternative Transportation Program in federal lands was started. And this actually required further studies of transit, especially looking at planning procedures and congestion management in parklands. And it really improved the coordination across parks and the surrounding areas, because you really can't study one without looking at the other. They're really connected to each other, and you need to consider them together. And T21 really helps that communication to do that. So most recently, we have the Alternative Transportation in the Parks and Public Lands Program, and that kind of acronym is ATPPL, and this was established through the most recent legislation, Safety Lieu, and it funds capital and planning expenses specifically for alternative transportation systems in parks, mainly in parks, but it also extends for other federal lands. And the goals of this program are many, and it's quite ambitious, and to be recognized for it, it's quite great. They conserve natural, historical, and cultural resources, reducing congestion and pollution, improving visitor mobility and accessibility, enhancing visitor experiences, and ensuring access to all, including persons with disabilities. And so this is kind of very much in line with what we're talking about today. We want to make sure that we include these alternative transportation systems, but in order to address congestion and pollution at the same time as maintaining our natural, historical, and cultural resources. But in order to get funding to support these alternative transportation programs, you really need to show a need and show some kind of plan for how and why this is going to be successful. So we do that through transportation planning, and a huge component of this are those quantitative methods that can set out exactly how your federal land or mobility or congestion are going to be improved by implementing this alternative transportation system. And so these quantitative methods predict the number of visitors and activity participations. They incorporate a variety of concerns into decision making. So we want to make sure that we're addressing the environment, economic, and mobility concerns that we talked about. We want to be responsive to changes in management styles. So if we change management in addition to alternative transportation systems, we want to see how that's going to affect behavior and resources. And of course, as kind of the baseline for this presentation, we want to allow for the inclusion of alternative transportation systems and see what kind of role that would play in all of those other components. And so, as I said, those are the things we want to quantify, those are the things we need to describe, and there's a variety of ways to do that. And each one of these measures or techniques balances between visitors' experiences and the natural resources differently. And so that's kind of the big thing, the big picture that we keep coming back to, is this balance between visitors' experience and natural resources. And we want to make sure that it's an equal balance, that we're not too far on one side, which would hurt the other. So as these are listed here, user resource methods, which essentially, if you're familiar with the term cost-benefit analysis, that's really what a user resource method is. It's just looking at cost benefits for visitors' experiences and natural resources. We also have a social ecology method, which is more of an inventory or a checklist with different weighting schemes to make sure that we're meeting especially those natural resources, which can sometimes, all those tiny details can be overlooked. We have a recreation opportunity spectrum, and this is more of a rating system. So this one requires survey work and going out and talking to visitors, and this one looks at recreation diversity, and it's based on visitor density, management techniques, region development, and visitors' perceptions of all of these things. And finally, we have travel demand forecasting, and this is a series of models that kind of predict where people are going, what they want to do, and it takes into consideration all of the factors affecting experiences and all the factors affecting natural resources as well. So it's kind of a full spectrum there of pretty simple from those cost-benefit analyses to the more complex travel demand models. And so there's a real depth across all of those that needs to be supported, and to get good quantifiable information to describe the impact of alternative transportation systems, we really need to consider the idea of demand, which is the number of visitors and what they're expecting when they come to federal lands. So demand needs to consider travel to public lands, travel to specific destinations within a destination there, and then also navigating around public lands. So if you hit an area and you are able to get in, but you're sitting in a long line to access a parking lot, that's not really meeting demand. And so alternative transportation systems can serve as the transportation to reach these activities, an activity in and of itself, and it's actually quite often described as an opportunity to share information about the area. So as you're going through federal land or perhaps a national park, information can be given to visitors to enhance their experiences, which is kind of part of the activity in and of itself. And so we need to manage specific demands while maintaining these resources. And I'm just coming back to the idea of balancing, using transportation systems to balance between meeting demand and managing nature. Okay, and so we have a number of poll questions that we've come to. I'd like to kind of gauge your idea on these things. And I've talked quite a bit about alternative transportation systems and the concerns we have with them and planning for them. And so I wanted to get your ideas on which activities, either at a destination or actually on a specific mode, so if you're riding a shuttle bus, which ones are best suited for alternative transportation systems and why. So I'm going to break this up by a number of 3 different alternative transportation systems, and I'm curious if you were in this first one, walking or biking in federal lands, which of these activities would you be most likely to consider doing? Kind of which ones go hand in hand, I guess is the big question here. Great. Okay, I think everyone has responded. So it looks here that quite a few of you thought photography was a good connecting activity to do with walking or biking. And then others thought experiencing nature and seeing wildlife and hiking and backpacking were also important. I would agree that I think that walking and biking, the characteristics of those are very conducive to immersing yourself in nature and seeing wildlife. Of course, walking and biking is synonymous with hiking, right? And photography is a great way to capture that experience. Okay, so let's look at the next poll, which would, same question. If you were in a shuttle bus at a federal lands or national park, which of these activities would you be most likely to participate in, using the shuttle to get there or on the shuttle itself? Okay, well, looks like everyone has responded, and it's a 50-50 split between experiencing nature and photographing natural wonders. So again, this idea of experiencing nature from the shuttle is a great opportunity, perhaps more so than your own vehicle, because you're not worried about watching the traffic in front of you. You can actually pay attention to what's going on around you. Great. And for our third one, here's the idea of a personal vehicle. And so if you actually were driving around in your own car, which of these activities would you be most likely to go to or do in your vehicle? Oh, interesting. Okay, so we have everyone responded, I think. Yep. And the 2 largest ones are, again, experiencing nature and camping with family or friends, both with 33%. And we also have a couple of votes for going on a picnic and photographing natural wonders again. So I'm not surprised. Across the board, once we talk about federal lands, a big draw for federal lands is outdoor recreation, which you see across these things, and experiencing nature, seeing wildlife. That's one of the biggest reasons that people go to these areas to start with. So the nice thing about personal vehicles is that you have perhaps better access to areas because you can drive in much closer where a shuttle would have to drop you off somewhere. And I would agree that camping is definitely, especially if you pull up to a campsite, that makes much more sense to have your own vehicle there. Okay. And so to wrap up this section, I just wanted to reiterate this idea that it's no one-size-fits-all alternative transportation solution. And the transportation solutions that we consider, very much based off what we talked about in that poll, what you can do with each different mode or each system is different. And so you really need to consider your type of federal land, the needs of the natural resources in the area, what can you sustain, what kind of transportation infrastructure are you working with, that would it be able to handle even certain types of transportation systems. And what I was really trying to get at with that series of polls is the interest of visitors. And you need to make sure that what transportation systems you select and you plan for and you collect data on, you really want to make sure that those systems match with the interests of visitors, because if it doesn't, then there's really no point in including it. And of course, you need to include proper planning to identify local concerns and opportunities for funding and support. Many times, actually, you can get funding specifically for addressing different concerns and making sure that if you can quantify how that's going to improve a certain concern, say an environmental concern, that can direct you to specific sources of funding. And then it's important to recognize that we can't just simply throw in alternative transportation systems into an area and expect it to work and solve all of our problems. This planning really needs to come into effect to understand how it's going to affect behavior, experiences, and resources. And of course, people react to ATS differently, and we need to recognize that and consider it in planning.
Great. So before we move on to section 3, I just wanted to pause for a moment and find out if anyone has any questions. Again, you can either use your Q&A drop-down menu to type in your question, or you can certainly press *8 on your telephone keypad, and that will open up the telephone line in order for you to ask your question directly to Jeff. Jeff, you've certainly given us a number of things to think about. It's a complex issue, and I'm interested to hear the third chapter on managing impacts.
Well, great. Thank you.
It looks like we have one question. Can you expand on the different types of ATS?
Oh, sure. I would be happy to. The way this presentation is set up is I wanted to talk about the concerns and the real issues that are going on in national parks and other federal lands and things like that, but at the end get into all of the nitty-gritty details of each of those alternative transportation systems and how we can use those to address those concerns and issues. But I guess I didn't explain what all of the ATS were to start off with. So when we talk about ATS, they can include everything from rather unmotorized modes like walking and biking in an area, all the way up to more complicated systems like shuttles or buses. Some areas even have light rail going in, and there's many variations on this too. You can have buses that run on diesel or biofuels or are electric vehicles. So there's many variations to this as well. And you can include ferries in this category as well. Pretty much any other mode besides personal vehicles like cars or motorcycles or trucks or campers are considered alternative transportation systems. Good question. Thank you. Okay, so let's see. Section 3. And I'd like to just say that the next two sections, sections 3 and 4, are where I'm going to talk about, so we want to plan for these concerns, and we want to make sure to document how these concerns are affecting our federal lands. And so Section 3 and Section 4 are a further discussion of impacts of mobility, economic, and environmental concerns and how those are going to impact, in Section 3, natural resources. And in Section 4, we're going to talk more about visitor behavior and their experiences in parks and federal lands. So I just want to say that up front because we'll first focus on the natural resources and how kind of the congestion and issues in parks and federal lands are going to affect natural resources. Okay, so the real big idea here is that if we don't do anything with our transportation systems, we are really threatening public lands' ability to sustain themselves over time. And if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, we talked quite a bit about the need to not only make federal lands great destinations today, but also in the future. And so that's the idea behind sustainability. So these are federal lands are uniquely preserved natural resources, and the fact that it's that unique preservation going on, that's a huge draw. And actually we saw that quite a bit when I did the poll with you. Experiencing nature is a huge piece of this. And so the Environmental Protection Agency defines sustainability as policies and strategies that meet society's present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's the idea that we want to serve today and the future and make sure that what we do in our federal lands is going to support both. However, the more vehicles and visitors that we attract to public and federal lands currently, the greater issues we're going to have in the future for natural resources. And so we have larger crowds are causing spills into, or they themselves are spilling into areas where they shouldn't be if there's too many of them. And so many times if there's paths or hiking trails, they're marked off as to where people should be, but if there's just too many, they're going to have to expand somewhere. And then we have road zone effect zones. And so this is the idea that when you have a road that runs through federal lands, it's not just the road itself that we need to be concerned with, but the effects of that road actually extend for hundreds of meters from either side of that road. And it's like a buffer zone, if you will, on either side of that that's going to affect the environment, whether it's noise, air pollution, solid waste that gets thrown from vehicles. It's going to affect the environment, wildlife, everything along that area. And actually, this impact that we're talking about here grows exponentially as you start increasing your entire transportation system. It becomes much a bigger impact. And so the materials we also use are significant. Whether we use pavement or all the way down to dirt on them is going to affect the environment and wildlife and how they perceive our transportation system. And as I keep saying here, that the impacts extend to wildlife, natural environments, to air quality, and infrastructure. We'll talk about those in turn. So for each of these kind of issues, I broke it up by the different transportation concerns and what those concerns are and how they're going to affect our natural resources. And so when we talk about wildlife populations, of course, protecting land buffers, air and solid pollutants, the cultural character of areas, and then crowding and congestion are all going to play a role in affecting wildlife and what they do in these federal lands. And we need to see that when we have congestion, we have higher mortality rates along roadways. The more roads we put in, the more exposure animals have to vehicles, and they usually don't win. And so we have interaction with visitors can cause stress for animals. It disrupts their feeding patterns and where they feed. It changes their habitat and sometimes forces them to abandon or avoid areas if they're trying to avoid people or vehicles. And what's kind of interesting is endangered species, which are often commonly found in federal lands, are especially sensitive to people and congestion and vehicles, so we need to be very concerned about them. And what's another issue that we need to be concerned about is habitat fragmentation. And this is the idea that actually it's a great example with this buffalo here in the picture, where buffalo migrate to different areas, and once you put a road or some kind of transportation network, it bisects their area, it will disrupt where they move. And sometimes they are willing to cross the road if it's just part of their migration patterns, but other times it can break up where they're willing to go, and so you can separate groups of animals and fragment their habitat just based on where you put that road. It becomes a natural barrier that they will not cross. And what happens because of this is that you can sometimes get higher mortality rates, both due to the road network, but also due to the fact that we're fragmenting those habitats. Okay, so one of the other big issues that we have is eroding and contaminating the natural environment or these habitats. And so habitats are not just for animals, but we kind of have an ecosystem that we need to be concerned with. And so there's all these different transportation concerns that are affecting these issues, developing these issues. And we see that when we have a high level of demand, maybe higher than we planned for, people are bringing things in we're not expecting. We see exotic and invasive species that are disrupting these ecosystems and the natural development of an area. And this is especially concerning for us because of the fact that federal lands are so nature-based, and we really need to protect that because that's the draw, essentially, for the area. That's what people are coming to experience. So we need to make sure that these issues are especially addressed. We also have erosion of areas next to roads, trails, and other development. And this just could be because there's higher levels of use than we were planning for, or the fact that people are spilling off into different areas. We have trampling and removal of vegetation from people coming through, vehicles coming through, loss of soil nutrients. The more we develop for our transportation system, the more physical land area we're taking up that can affect the soil nutrients and development of these things. And of course, all of these issues vary by location, design, and the transportation mode we're talking about. Issues of hiking are, of course, significantly different from driving and all these other modes we would consider. Air quality and creating smog. This is a huge issue, and this is a picture from the Grand Canyon, which if someone's going there to see the Grand Canyon and there's smog there, that's not the experience they're looking for. So all these concerns are affecting air quality and smog in many different ways, and we have it's of course related to wildlife and natural environment impacts. The air and solid pollutants are going to affect the health and movement of wildlife and natural environment. Congestion and idling for vehicles is going to lead to increased emissions. And so the better we can manage and plan for vehicles in our federal lands, the better we can deal with that increased emissions issue. The more vehicles we have also leads to the higher likelihood of runoff or spills. And then the larger vehicles, of course, reduce air quality further. If you're using less quality fuel, it's going to create more smog, more pollutants. And it's also important to recognize this issue of noise pollution that's going to affect the visitor experience and also the natural environment. And finally, I found this really surprising that the number of natural parks in regional air quality non-attainment has more than doubled in the past 5 years. So this is the idea that the federal government has set standards as to what's an acceptable level of pollutants in our air, and the number of national parks, just using as an example, has more than doubled in the past 5 years. That's quite significant, and clearly an issue that we need to address. Okay, so we are wearing down roadway and an amenity infrastructure too. There's currently a real lack of funding to support building infrastructure, supporting infrastructure. So that's a major issue, that the more people we have, the more vehicles we have, if we're not planning for them, then we're going to need to deal with higher levels of breakdown on roads, on bridges, and things like that. And so continued use, increased volumes, and larger, heavier vehicles really is wearing out our infrastructure. And at the same time as not having this funding, most of the roads that were built in federal lands were built in the 50s and 60s, and so they're starting to reach their age limit and just naturally breaking down too. So we need to really address this issue. So an interesting statistic here is that 90% of all public land roads are currently labeled as fair to poor condition, which to me means this is a really significant issue that we need to address, hopefully using alternative transportation systems. Okay, so those were the major issues that we see associated with natural resources. And did we have any questions about those before we move on to talking about the issues for visitor behavior and experiences?
And again, if you've joined us late and you'd like to ask a question, you simply need to use the Q&A drop-down menu on the top of your screen to simply type your question. Or if you're joining us via the telephone, you simply need to press *8, and that will put your telephone number into a queue and will notify us that you have a question. And then when it's your turn, we'll open up your telephone line and you'll be able to ask your question to Jeff directly. So we'll just wait a few more seconds here in case some folks are typing to ask questions. And Jeff, it looks like there aren't any questions at this time, so if you want to move on to section 4, please proceed.
Okay, great. Thanks. And again, if anything comes up that you think of, feel free to call in or type in or whatever it is. Well, great. So section 3, I started with talking about these impacts and issues with natural resources because it's such a key component of national parks and federal lands and public lands that we automatically think of that and automatically think of how what we're doing in those areas starts affecting the natural resources. But maybe to a lesser degree, and I'm sure many people still consider the impact on visitor behavior, but it's not what you think of right off the bat. So I would like to expand a little bit on how issues of mobility and economics and environment in our federal lands affects visitor behavior and experiences in them. And so, as I said, federal lands are unique destinations, and it's because of their cultural and environmental character that people are drawn to them. And as we saw with your polling question, it's kind of a key thing that people are there to appreciate the scenery and view wildlife and do these outdoor recreation activities. And so the increased volumes, unfortunately, can limit what visitors can do and the quality of their experiences. If there's too many people, too much congestion, too much crowding, it really limits what they do and their quality of their experience. And so the behavior and experience need to be considered in conjunction because they're really complementary. How someone feels in federal lands really depends on what they're able to do there and if they're able to do what they want. And so I found this really interesting example from Denali, where 92% of visitors there stated that wildlife viewing was an important reason for the trip, which is not surprising. It's one of those great preserved areas to view wildlife. But actually 87% of them stated that if they were unable to see wildlife, the trip would be a disappointment. And obviously that's not sustainable for federal lands. If we want to keep growing and maintain them and have support for them in the future, we need to continue to make sure that people are able to not be disappointed. And so it's important to consider these experiences and behaviors, especially during the leisure and outdoor recreation in these public lands. And this is because travelers actually have higher values of leisure time, and because it's their essentially free time, they're doing what they want, they have stronger opinions about congestion and delay, and they kind of feel it more because this is their free time that they're losing out on. And so one issue that we have is this diminishing overall demand. And all of these different concerns, including the character, the congestion, infrastructure damage, all play a role into the demand for an area. And the demand for destinations, activities, and modes is controlled by many individual factors, including the cost, time, attractiveness, demographics. All these different things are affecting who's coming and what they want to do. And I kind of mentioned the idea of demand, or people demanding an area, when we talked about the planning issues, and this is very much in conjunction with it, that we need to measure the demand in order to better plan for an area. And so as parks become more busy and lose their environmental character, this demand is going to diminish because what people are going for is just not there anymore. So we really need to protect this character and their experience for an area. And so involvement in activities is also an important issue. And if people aren't able to access activities or activities aren't available that they want to participate in, it's going to really affect what they do in an area and their experience of the area. And so when visitors come to public lands, they do so to really participate in the unique activities that are there. And as I've said over and over, this is really to view scenery, wildlife, and the outdoor recreation includes hiking and fishing and camping, of course. So there's this idea of the fact that visitors really want to expand their time and use it as wisely as possible. And so when they visit federal lands, that they are going to participate in a variety of activities within their limited available time. And so we can jump to the next slide. As activities become overcrowded or congested, so for example, if you're on a hiking trail that just becomes too congested, people won't be able to participate in it the way they want to. And so that's really going to impact their trip experience. And that's a huge piece of the federal lands mission, is trying to maintain that experience. And it's possible that as these activities become less attractive, people are going to shift over to other activities that maybe won't have as high a level experience. So if there was that famous trail they really wanted to go on and it's just too crowded, okay, they'll hike on something else, but that still just isn't the same. So you need to really manage what is available on these activities. And so, of course, they're going to replace trips. So it's even possible that they won't even replace trips within the federal lands, that they may just replace hiking there with hiking somewhere else entirely. And so that's obviously not sustainable either, as diminishing that overall demand. And it's also important to recognize that first-time visitors are definitely more interested in a broader set of activities. So when you see visitors come for the first time to your area, it's been documented that they're the ones that are going to be most likely to participate in lots of different things, from hiking to doing interpretive sessions with guides to fishing, things like this. They're going to be more likely to do a variety of activities. But the more experienced visitors that you have coming to an area, if you see people constantly coming back, they're going to specialize in some sort of outdoor recreation. For example, these people in the picture below have specialized in cycling at a federal land, and so they are coming there specifically for that activity. So in planning and managing, we need to make sure that our alternative transportation systems, for example, the bicycling here, are supporting both those first-time visitors and allowing them to access all these activities at once, but also supporting those experienced visitors that want to do specific things and do that especially well. That's a tall order, I do know, but it's something we do need to consider. Okay, so then we have this idea of interest in local amenities. So within federal lands and outside, especially in the surrounding areas, we have effects and issues that we need to address with alternative transportation systems. So there's the economic effect. We haven't really talked too much about how economic concerns are playing a role, kind of a little bit here and there about funding, but this really comes into play in that interaction between sustaining the area and sustaining the outside region. So the idea is that economic effects and concerns play a big role in parking congestion. They're affecting the ability to access desired businesses, especially outside the park or federal land or the development that you see out there. That really works hand in hand to support the federal lands. So we need to make sure that what we do for alternative transportation systems connects with both of those at the same time. And a great example here is from Acadia National Park up in Maine. And they have an Island Explorer shuttle bus that takes visitors through the entire park, but also stops at local businesses on the outskirts of the park. And this has been great for encouraging visitors to connect with businesses and businesses getting involved with the national park. It also allows new segments of tourists to reach those businesses. But one additional benefit is that visitors will tend to park outside of the federal lands and hop on the shuttle and then head into the federal lands, which is completely removing the effect of vehicles inside those federal lands. So it's kind of a win-win for both the economic concerns, because we are providing funding and providing sustainable development there, but we're also making sure that we reduce the impact of vehicles inside the park. And so then another one that we often don't think of is actually the inherent enjoyment of travel. And this really plays a big role in visitor experience and what they feel about their trip to federal lands. And so especially when we start talking about leisure travel or outdoor recreation travel, people really enjoy the effect of traveling together to go somewhere. And being in the car together may not for every family, but for many times is an experience in and of itself. And so the idea of traveling within public lands, either by vehicle or by foot, is an important and common activity in and of itself. So especially in the federal lands where experiencing and immersing yourself in nature is so important, we have this thing of trying to provide good experiences at all times, because people are going to be in their car experiencing nature. Once they get out and start walking around, that's an even more immersive experience. So alternative transportation really needs to recognize that it needs to support all different types of travel, both in the vehicle and outside. And so visitors now expect to see and experience things from their vehicle as part of the trip, and sometimes this can actually be challenging to offer. And not surprisingly, congestion, the pollutants from vehicles, and the damaged infrastructure can negatively affect this inherent enjoyment or experience of the travel. If it's somehow deteriorated to the point where it's not as pristine or what people were expecting, that can really affect their experience level. And then commonly, in looking at research and just documentation and reports, when people implement alternative transportation systems, they say that visitors identified crowding, flexibility, access, and tranquility as the most meaningful indicators for travel experience. And so we talked a little about those indicators of quality. Here are some of them as to how we can describe the quality experience that people are having. And it's important to recognize that while alternative transportation systems in parks and national lands are a great option and something we should really consider, there is kind of a benefit to the personal vehicle that we need to balance out. That's a real boost to enjoyment of travel, that it allows you freedom and convenience to go around areas as you please. You don't have to wait for a vehicle or get dropped off a certain area. You can typically go pretty close to where you want to be, but then you also are sharing the experiences with those people you're traveling with. And this is not to say that alternative transportation systems can't provide those things, but we need to make sure that it does, because these are the main draws for those for public vehicle or personal vehicles, that we need to kind of balance if we're going to implement alternative transportation systems. Okay, so then the last issue that we have here for kind of looking at experiences and behavior is this idea of personal perceptions and expectations. And what people expect when they go to federal lands plays a huge role in what they do there and how they experience the area. And so sometimes, maybe unfairly, they come in with extremely high expectations. And so when we implement alternative transportation systems, we need to make sure that we're meeting those expectations and meeting those perceptions. And oftentimes people have poor perceptions of alternative transportation systems, which puts a higher, I guess, need on those alternative transportation systems to make sure that we're kind of surpassing their perceptions of what it could be. And so the impacts that we really need to be concerned with and need to address with the alternative transportation systems is how individuals perceive the region and the expectations they have for it are really important for defining their experience. And so if we can implement a system that is good at meeting their expectations, then we've done a great job in defining their experience. In fact, even similar trip themes, for example, experiencing culture, can mean different things to different people. And so if someone's going there to experience the culture of an area, or they really want to experience nature, that could mean something different from one person to another. And one person riding in a shuttle to experience that would be enough. Another person needs to get out and actually walk around and experience it hands-on. So we need to make sure that we understand what typically visitors' experiences mean to them. And so most visitors actually have very high expectations for federal lands, and the drivers of personal vehicles, who are the ones that are sitting behind the wheel and dealing directly with the congestion and sitting in the stop-and-go traffic, are the ones that are most significantly affected by that congestion. And as a result, they don't have as good an experience during their trip. And unfortunately, that's typically the parents if it's a family, and they're the ones that are paying for the trip, who have driven and spent all the time to go there. And so, again, it's not really sustainable if their experiences aren't met or expectations aren't met, because they're less likely to actually return or tell others to go because they had such a good time. And so what this can do is it translates into loyalty. The better we can provide experiences, the better we meet expectations, the more likely people are going to come back and tell others to come back. And that's really critical for future growth and sustainability. And what I pulled here was just an example from the national parks. It's called the Passport to Your National Parks book. And it's kind of a program that people use to take, every time you visit a national park, you get a stamp in the book for that date that you visited. And people sort of collect these as they go around. So it's really showing that people do currently have a great loyalty to federal lands, national parks, public lands, all these things that they want to continue to experiencing them. Not just the same ones, but multiple too. So we kind of have a great base to work off of, which is nice, and we need to support that with the alternative transportation systems. And some of the major issues here are the pollution and crowding can really hurt experiences, as I've said, and make it so that people aren't meeting their expectations and meeting their perceptions. And these buffers that I've talked about on the outside of, or on either side of roadways or areas are really a critical key to this whole game, I guess, of perceptions and expectations, because it's a subtle way that we can manage areas without detracting from visitor experiences. And a good example is from Yosemite National Park, that 87% of visitors there said that visual buffers would detract from their experience. So if you start putting up too many barriers, for example, along roadways or along hiking trails, that's really going to detract from people's experience there. So alternative transportation systems are a way for us to minimize those buffers and minimize the need for developing physical, visible buffers. Okay, so I've been talking quite a bit about this idea of crowds, and it's a real piece of this mobility concerns that we have. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the idea of crowds and what we can do with them, and how crowds play a role in your visitor experiences and visitor behavior, which is such an important part of federal lands. So there's a number of concerns that play a role here, and the impacts that we're really concerned about are, first, that crowding can take place in many different ways. And people perceive crowds in different ways, is what I'm trying to say here. So visitor conflicts for different sized groups. So people may not like it if they're encountering too many different sized groups along the way, especially on trails. And oftentimes there are shared use paths. That's one type of alternative transportation system that allows walking, running, biking, all off the same pathway. And so those are different activities, and so too many conflicts between too many different types of activities can also cause perceptions of congestion and crowding. So another way we can describe crowding is unacceptable number of encounters on trailheads, in visitor centers, on trails, at campsites. Of course, when there are crowds that are destroying the natural resources, that's going to be a huge detractor. And finally, congestion and traffic can be another type of crowd that we see. So we have both walking and any kind of mode you can experience crowding in, really. And that can take the form of congestion on roads or parking spaces. And so this actually is a recurring topic in our discussion here because this really affects and it's connected to how people perceive an area. And the way people want to use federal lands is to connect with nature. Oftentimes it's being alone or having these specialized experiences that you may not accomplish if there's a huge crowd around you. And so that kind of gets into the ideas of perceptions and experiences. And then, of course, the more crowds you have, the more likely they are to spill out into past the designated areas where they should be, which is going to further impact your natural environment. So it's almost a cyclical problem here that we need to address quickly. And finally, we measure this by considering people at a single time on a trail, in a facility, or pursuing a specific activity. So I was hoping to do a poll with everyone to kind of talk about this idea of crowding and how we perceive crowding. And this is actually based off of the work from Dr. Bob Manning, who has joined us here. So the idea here is that for each of these photographs, we're going to show a number of photographs here. And I'd like each of you, when we jump into the poll, to show, select how acceptable you think this image is, or imagine yourself in this environment looking, and this is your view. So you should rate each photograph by indicating how acceptable you think it is based on the number of people shown. And so a rating of -4 means that the number of people, -3 is very unacceptable. But then I guess we've reversed it here. So a value of 3 means that it's very acceptable, and a value of -3 meant that it was very unacceptable. Okay, we're still waiting for a few. Okay, great. Well, here the majority, 80% of you said that that last view with not a single person was very acceptable. Okay, so here is the next picture. So we can jump after seeing that one. How would you rate this one? How acceptable is it? And on the scale from very acceptable down to very unacceptable. Wow, okay, so we had 3 responses for this one, and they were split. One person said this was still very acceptable, one person said this was moderately acceptable, and one person said that this was unacceptable. Okay, so we see that adding more people is starting to shift things. Here's one more picture for you. How acceptable is this one? Okay, things are much more split here. We had 4 responses, and 1 for acceptable, 1 for moderately acceptable, one for moderately unacceptable and one for very unacceptable. Okay, so we're seeing a broader split here. And here's your next picture. How acceptable is it to be on that hiking trail? Okay, 60% of you said unacceptable for that one, and 40% said very unacceptable. So we've hit kind of the limit for this is not acceptable anymore. Okay, and we have, I believe, one more. This is how acceptable is this for you? Okay, that was pretty fast. All of you went quickly to very unacceptable. And so everybody said very unacceptable for that one. Okay, and so we won't actually need to do the poll for this one, but this is kind of your extreme end where everyone has filled up the path, and so I would assume that since the previous poll was everyone for very unacceptable, that this would be the same. And so the way that we translate this is into a graph like this, where we've taken, this is an example based off of that specific set of pictures, and so we've taken it and we tally up the average responses for each of them. And so here you can see on the graph, the left-hand side of the graph shows the level of acceptability. And when this was used in the field, 4 represented the most acceptable and -4 was the least acceptable. And so they were asked, everyone was asked to rank it, very similar to the way you were with the poll. And then on the bottom axis of this table, we see people per viewscape, or the people that are there on the trail. And so that first picture we looked at had 0, but I believe the second one is the one with 8 people. And so the majority of people on that one, the average score was between 3 and 4. And then we moved to 12 people on the trail. We saw an average score between 2 and 3. And 19 is between, or pretty darn close to -1, and so on and so forth. Once we hit 31, it was pretty unacceptable with very close to -3. And so the way this is broken up further is by a level of service. And so as the number of people we can identify here as a level of service that we can kind of go along the continuum. So we see that somewhere between 12 and 9 is between B and C, and D and E are the ones that we really don't want. So beyond 19 is probably not preferable. So we need to find some way to manage the environment so that there are no more than, say, 20 people at one time on there to preserve everyone's experience on that area.
And Jeff, it looks like we have one question about the graph. Somebody wanted to know what LOS stood for.
Oh, thank you. LOS is level of service. It's an acronym for level of service. And so it describes how good the service is. It's often used in transportation to describe streets and intersections and how easy is it to get around. Same thing would apply here. How easy is it, or in this case, it's actually more related to your level of experience on this pathway. And so A represents the best level of service that you could receive, whereas E is the worst level of service that you could get. Okay, so I just wanted to show a number of other examples, and we're not going to do a poll for this one along the way, but if you want to just kind of internally, as we're going along, try and figure out where your limit is. Oh, I see a question here.
Yes, it looks like the question is, so this is the difference from transportation when there is a level of that is at the worst. That is the worst.
Right. In transportation, we have level of service A through F most often. And so I believe this person's talking about level of service F being the worst. And that's exactly correct. When we I'll go back one slide. In this case, the level of service, it's not extended past E to a level of F. Level E is considered the worst. But yes, that's the same thing. So E would, I guess, translate into the same idea of a level of service F for a transportation network, if you're familiar with that terminology. Yep. Hopefully I've answered your question. Okay, so as I said, these next slides, I'm just going to run through, kind of simulate more and more growth on these, more and more demand, I should say, on these different environments. And so you can just internally think, where is your threshold for my acceptable level of service? So here, starting off with no one, we've added a few more, some more walkers that are on there, additional people, we've added more, even more, and the end result from this is, again, a very similar graph to what we saw with the previous one. And here we have the level of acceptability starting at 0 as very high, all the way down to about 30 to 36 is where it starts getting pretty poor level of service level. And then we'll continue. Here's another example. And so those ones were really based on walking was the first example that we did the poll for. There were more bikes on the ones the example that I just showed. But here's an example of a level of service or level of acceptability for crowding for vehicles, and what it would be like if you're on a roadway in federal lands based on vehicles. So that's with no vehicles. Here's a few. Some more. Even more. And that one looks pretty congested to me. So again, we can see that the graph for this, same thing. On the left-hand column, we have the acceptability, and along the bottom, we have number of automobiles in each photograph. And so on a survey of people who we collected, or people were interviewed on this, the average number, the average level of acceptability that they reported for 0 vehicles was close to 3. Then it continued to drop over as more automobiles were introduced in the pictures. So somewhere between 5 and 10 is that cutoff between whether it's acceptable or unacceptable. And here's just an example of another way that you could describe an indicator of quality for acceptability of using crowding levels. And here's one for the Alcatraz ferry, talking about the number of people that you would experience while you're on the ferry and just ranking it differently. So instead of using photographs, you could easily use a survey such as this. And based off that one, here is a curve to show the level of acceptability. And so, interestingly, on this one, it peaked with slightly different values along the way, but we see that it drops between acceptable to unacceptable somewhere around this level of service D. And here's another one, again using the Alcatraz ferry to talk about level of service based on frequencies, and so how often the ferry came. And again, each person being given the survey would be asked to rank the different service level on whether it was acceptable or unacceptable. And here's the curve for this one, very similar. So again, that cutoff between acceptable and unacceptable comes in somewhere between around 30 minutes. Okay, so we've really talked, I guess we should pause for a moment for questions, if there are any questions about that. We really just covered the major issues that are impacting natural resources, and visitor experiences and behavior. So that was a lot of information on those.
Great. If there are any questions, this would be a great time to either type them in the Q&A drop-down menu or press *8 on your telephone keypad, and you'll be able to talk to Jeff directly and ask him any questions. We'll certainly see some great slides this afternoon with a lot of movement and interaction, which was a nice thing to see, especially on a webinar. So it looks like we have one question.
Yeah, one question was, how big were the sample sizes for the data just presented? That's a great question. And actually, if it's possible, I'd like to turn that over to Dr. Bob Manning to address that, since those were actually his studies.
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Jeff. I've been enjoying your presentation. Well, the sample sizes really vary quite a bit from place to place. I think the examples we saw were some surveys of ferry users at Alcatraz Island, and then we saw the bicycle example on the carriage roads at Acadia National Park, and the walking sample was done, or study was done at Muir Woods National Monument in California. And I think the sample sizes in all of those cases were a minimum of 200 respondents, and in some cases ranged up to maybe 400 or 500 respondents. So I think the statistical validity of the results that we looked at is pretty fine.
Great, thank you very much.
That looks like all the questions, so if you want to continue on to section 5, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Okay, so the way we've structured this is starting off with talking about the major concerns, and then talking about how those concerns are going to impact both natural resources and the visitor experiences, which are two of the most critical pieces of federal lands. And now the idea is to talk about all those different alternative transportation system opportunities and how we can use these things to address those issues and those concerns. So we'll talk about 3 of the big ones, first starting with walking, and then we'll talk about bicycles, and finally shuttle systems and how each of these can be used. So again, I'm coming back to this idea that there's no one-size-fits-all, and this is especially true for alternative transportation solutions and planning for them. So there's no perfect solution, or you can't just throw one of these into your federal lands and expect it to solve all your problems. Instead, planners need to select the system, or it's possible to have multiple systems. I think to some extent, most federal lands have walking as a mode that's present there, but there are many ways to improve the walking experience and improve that as a meaningful mode in and of itself in federal lands. And so the alternative transportation systems, we have to recognize, are really not a traditional approach to public lands. As I said, up until the 70s, they weren't considered at all. And so everything has really been built around automobiles and your personal vehicle. And so that's the way a lot of people think about moving around, not just federal lands, but in general. So we really need to slowly adapt and allow time for visitors to adjust and adapt to this as well. But the positive news is that in the many places where we have done alternative transportation systems, visitors have quickly adjusted and adapted and learned to really enjoy those systems. So there are, as I said, 3 of the most successful ones is what we're going to talk about today: walking, cycling, and shuttles. So we really have a number of goals that we want to do, and this is, of course, as I said, we're going to use alternative transportation systems to address issues of resource protection and improving visitor experiences. So those are the 2 issues that we want to get back at. And so we can use alternative transportation to reduce emission, reduce noise levels, and the impacts that vehicles have on wildlife. So in a sense, we can use alternative transportation to remove vehicles from the system and have everyone ride on shuttles, but we can also shift them to something else. So instead of riding in their personal vehicle, we can put them on walking or biking through the area as well. It also provides visitation and resource balance tools, so we're able to control visitation and demand a little bit better. It's still important to recognize what that demand is, though. And so we can also exchange those auto impacts for foot impacts, which are generally less expensive. And finally, we can adjust the visitation patterns. So it's not just the number of people that are coming to your federal lands, but we can also use alternative transportation to adjust what they do when they're inside those federal lands, how they move around those areas, and what activities they do inside them. And so this kind of leads us into the visitor experiences, and we can use alternative transportation systems to establish this shared vision with opportunities for multiple participation. We can use it to improve the quality of desired experience of driving in the transportation planning world, of exchanging versus rescripting. And so the idea here is that we can either change what people are doing, or when we talk about rescripting, that means that we are shifting what they would typically be doing. So for exchanging, we would be shifting from one thing to another. So for example, we would be changing what activity they'd be doing once they go inside. Or rescripting, we would be just shifting things slightly by saying, okay, well, they'll still be hiking and on this trail. However, to get there, instead of driving there, they may take a shuttle. So that's the difference between a major change and a minor change. But both are equally effective in trying to improve visitor experiences. Then we have visitation management and transportation strategies that still enable high-quality experiences. Of course, that's an underlying goal of all alternative transportation systems, is we don't just want to implement it and have it ruin the experience that people are having there. It needs to work within what they want and what they're expecting on their trip. And then a good example is that Zion National Park that I referred to before, actually their ridership increased independent of visitation. So people kept coming and the ridership just exploded once they implemented the alternative transportation system there. So people will get on board, and it adds to their experience because it's kind of an activity in and of itself. And so another thing we talk about is this soundscape. And so when you go to federal lands, it's part of experiencing nature that we've talked about. Part of seeing wildlife is hearing them too. And so that's how you can partly appreciate all the senses are important. And so it's not just that noise, it could be smells and everything, and by reducing the number of vehicles, by implementing alternative transportation, we have more opportunities to provide those sounds and provide those smells, provide those sights. And then we also see that there are new visitor patterns at places that have implemented alternative transportation systems. Visitors actually spend longer there, and which sometimes translates to spending more money there. And it means that they also stay in the community gateways. So if there's some kind of development on the outskirts of your federal land, they're more likely to stay there longer too. And this could be for many reasons, including just ease of accessibility of getting around, or not having to worry about it, or reduced costs. Okay, so perhaps the easiest and one of the ones that's already there is, in many places, is promoting walking. And so from all these different alternative transportation systems that I'll talk about, they're broken up in terms of benefits and challenges. So we have to recognize that there are great opportunities for each of these. But we also have to temper that with the fact that there are some challenges associated with each of these that we need to take into consideration when we start developing them or use them for planning purposes, consider them for planning purposes. So the benefits for walking, the fact that there are already an extensive number of trails and walkways. If you remember when we started this presentation, I listed out all the hiking trails and things that were already present in federal lands, and it's just enormous. So what's nice is to promote walking as a really strong mode or a central mode to federal lands. All you need to do is start adding and extending connections. And so I have a question here that I will get to once I finish up this slide, if that's all right. We allow visitors also with walking to take their time, focus on the surroundings, move at their own pace, connect with the park, all these different things that we see as major draws for federal lands. That's why people go there, is to really interact with the environment and see things and experience things. And what we're doing in our personal vehicles is moving at our own pace, having that accessibility. And so while walking may be a little more time-consuming than driving your own vehicle, it still offers that own personalized, accessible aspect of it.
And
Yeah.
your question was, what type of ATS does Zion have, and what can the significant ridership increase be attributed to?
That's a great question. If I remember correctly, Zion National Park has all of the ones that we're going to talk about today. So, well, it kind of has a base of automobiles, but then it also promotes quite a bit of walking, and there's a big cycling program out there. I believe you can rent a bicycle at one of their visitor centers, and then they also have a shuttle system that takes people around as well. And the other part of the question was, why are they? Why did it increase?
Correct.
Okay, and so I believe that it increased simply because they built it in, and it actually took time for the number of riders to increase. But it's become for them a selling point for the federal land or national park, actually, that they have these things that enable people to move around really efficiently, and their system is quite good at getting people to important destinations in the park. And so I think that's the real reason why it grew in ridership. But that being said, it took a little bit of time for them to build that reputation of being efficient and being a great option to use. So. Oh, and I'm hearing here actually that the shuttle is actually required now in Zion National Park, and so that may be also another reason why it's become increased in ridership, is that it's actually required to move around much of the park. Thank you. Okay. Oh, and so the challenge is, I'll finish with the benefits actually, that the walking, you're able to control exposure to natural resources. As people start moving around, you have a better way of controlling that movement and maneuvering it around natural resources. And as I said, walking provides the epitome of personal experiences, where many studies actually have shown that people who are walking actually experience more significant experiences rather than in any other mode. So I think that's kind of interesting. In terms of challenges for walking, they require additional funding for the infrastructure to build all these additional connections between trails or walking paths and things like that. And they, of course, need continuous paths. Better connections are going to improve walking. Seating and benches and overhangs to provide shade are also important. And this can be a challenge because finding funding for this may be limited. But if you can show that this can improve your planning, if you could show through planning that this is going to improve your system and improve people's experiences, you're much better off at searching for that funding. And then, of course, this increases the area exposed to nature. The more trails you have, you're getting people deeper into protected areas. However, this is a less intrusive travel mode, so if you are providing this, it's better to have walking than, say, driving in your own personal automobiles. Okay. The second option for an alternative transportation system commonly used is incorporating bicycle facilities. And so these are best for areas where we have shorter travel distances between places. People, especially new cyclists, are not going to want to go or feel comfortable going too far on a bicycle. But it's also interesting, it's been shown that bicyclists, so people going to federal lands to ride around, are actually staying longer to participate in more activities than people who are in their personal vehicles. And this could be for a number of reasons. The fact that they just want to be out there, but I think a big portion of that is that the inherent enjoyment of the mode is a big piece of enjoying the federal lands at the same time. And so bicyclists are able and do travel further total distances during their trips to public lands. And this could also be related to the fact that they're spending more time and participating in more things once they're there. These could also be people who are more physically active, and so that's why they're doing more activities and traveling further distances too. So often cyclists select public lands as a destination because they can bike there. So the fact that they have that option for moving around is a huge draw in and of itself. And there are fewer cycling challenges in federal lands than there are in urban settings. So if you think about biking in a downtown urban area, it can be tricky because you have all these intersections, many different cars to deal with, lots of things going on at once. Where I'm not saying that federal lands are less intense. There's definitely a lot of factors that are going on, especially in terms of transportation there. But it's easier for cyclists to maneuver around this. You often have fewer intersections they have to deal with, more straight shots that they just go along, straight routes. And perhaps it's easier to make connections in federal lands rather than in a downtown area. So those are three things that cyclists enjoy and actually encourage people to cycle more. So it's actually interesting that many cyclists report it faster to get around by bike than it is by car. So this may be tempered a little bit by the fact that bicyclists are usually enthusiasts around cycling and are more likely to have traveled with a bike before coming to this area, and so they may be more efficient, but it still goes to show that in areas that are really congested with cars, cyclists don't have to stop and sit in that traffic. They can just keep riding on their own protected area. And finally, this can improve visitor experiences, not just for the enjoyment of riding your bike in a beautiful scenery, but it avoids congestion, provides you exercise, it allows you to interact with the environment a little bit, and as I said, the inherent enjoyment of the mode. And so cyclists are a main group that are mention this specific mode of transportation as a strong reason for going to the park. So the fact that if you can draw in cyclists to your area, just the fact that they're able to use their bike there is a huge boost to their enjoyment and their experience. So that's great for sustainable development. The challenges for biking and building the bike transportation networks is the fact that most cyclists, besides those diehards, are recreational riders. And at some of the parks where they have bike rental programs, they see many of those people are recreational riders and don't tend to go as far as those people who have biked more regularly. So as this kind of implies that areas may need to provide bikes for their visitors if they are recreational riders. They're interested in doing it, but they don't necessarily have one that they're going to take cross-country with them. So you may need to consider implementing and funding a bike rental program. A huge piece to biking and also walking to some extent is having a complete network. For every time that there's a break in the network or things aren't connected, you essentially have chopped it in pieces and made it very difficult for cyclists to go between areas. So it's really important that if you're going to build bicycle facilities as part of your alternative transportation system, that they be complete, provide access to all the important destinations, and are safe at the same time. Terrain needs to be considered. Obviously, bikes aren't perfect for every destination, where if it's extremely hilly, that can be very tough, especially for recreational riders. Weather can play a big role, although some cities have very wet weather or snow weather, and they still have many riders, but I think for recreational riders, they may be less inclined during colder weather. And types of facilities. You want to make sure that the types of facilities you put in, whether it's a bike lane on the side of a highway or the side of the road, or a shared use path that's separated from the roadway, that you decide whether it's appropriate for your area and what you have room for. And of course, you need to completely integrate your bicycle facilities with the current infrastructure and other modes. This kind of goes along the lines of whether you put in a shared use path or if you have room to add a bike lane. And but this also extends to include things like bike racks at visitor centers and on buses. You need to make sure that you're not just saying that you're going to include bicycle facilities and maybe just throwing down some lines. You need to really think about how to integrate it into your current management and operations and theme of the federal lands. And of course, along with this, you need new infrastructure with signage, distinguished bike lanes or shared paths, the crosswalks, enhancing shoulders. This can get a little tricky to fund, but as I said, if you are successful in figuring out how this is going to improve your situation and improve your management, improve your planning, then that gives you a much better opportunity for looking for funding. Okay, so the final topic that we want to talk about is shuttle systems. And so this is clearly a much bigger form of alternative transportation than walking or biking. Even though those are simple, those still require some dedicated funding, dedicated planning to make sure that they are integrated and feasible options. And the same thing applies here. It doesn't really matter the scale of what you're doing, of the alternative transportation system. It really matters on how well you integrate it and plan for it. And so the benefits of the shuttle system are that it provides probably the most significant impact on emissions, congestion, and visitor control. An example here from Muir Woods shuttle service is that they served over 14,500 passenger trips annually, and this increased in ridership over 40% each year. Same thing that we saw in Zion actually happened here, where it started off slow but then grew in ridership quite quickly. And as a result, which I find really impressive, is that an estimated 2,400 vehicles were eliminated by the shuttle system over just one season. So that's a considerable amount if you consider in terms of emissions and pollutants that are being put into your area. And it gets into improving the visitor experience. You have opportunities to avoid congestion by having them on there, difficult driving, parking issues that visitors just don't have to deal with that if they're on a shuttle. It also, and I like this, allows groups to travel together and all experience things together. A lot of visitors, when they were surveyed about shuttle systems, noted this as something that they were surprised about as a kind of benefit to their trip. And of course, there's less noise and air pollutants to distract visitors along the way. And I believe this was in the Muir Woods report that I read, that it was most often used when the parking lot was full. So it's a great alternative if you're not in your vehicle. I don't know if this is a true benefit, but just something to keep in mind when you're playing these things, that you're not going to completely eliminate personal vehicles unless you mandate it, but it's a great opportunity for overflow and to deal with that. So once you've hit that level of congestion, it then turns into shuttle service. And as I believe I said before, with reasonable fare is not a barrier to shuttle use. Some places offer or require some sort of payment to ride the shuttle system, and it actually can be combined with increase in parking fees to further influence travel behavior. So there's ways to manage the funding for this where it's not really going to impact visitors, and I didn't mind paying the fare if it improved their experience and their mobility. And so along with reducing the number of vehicles, we also reduce congestion, and in Acadia National Park, traffic increased about 1.5% out in the area, I think over a 5-year period inside the national park, but this was relative to a 15 to 20% increase in traffic outside the park and places where transit was not a component of it. So that's really interesting that you're not only reducing the number of vehicles, but of those vehicles that are there, you've reduced the amount of congestion a significant amount, or have the possibility of doing so. And it also has been shown to extend the amount of time people spend in public lands, and this can include a higher rate of spending, of course. This is especially true for older populations who aren't really able or willing or want to walk or drive through congestion. So they're a great kind of demographic to shoot for, is to switch over to shuttle service as you implement it at the beginning. So there are some challenges associated with shuttles, and they may be a little more significant than dealing with walking and biking, simply because it requires more infrastructure, more vehicles itself, more down payment into this. And of course, that's going to require more startup funding and investment in infrastructure. But there are opportunities to partner with local areas, national rural transit initiatives, and there are ways to collect funds for this by charging for parking as an alternative to riding the shuttle system. We also see that these shuttles are not always used or needed year-round, because there are peak periods, especially during the summer and weekends. But during the winters and lower demand periods, it's not always useful or financially responsible to have the shuttle system running for that few visitors. So that you kind of need to decide that on a location-to-location basis. There is important need to have clear information on how to use the shuttle system, and that's going to encourage ridership. If people aren't sure how to use it or how it works or where it's going, then they will be significantly less likely to ride the shuttle system. So you need to invest in wayfinding signs and kind of a marketing system for your shuttle system at first. And it can be harder. You really need to figure out how you're going to operate your shuttle system, because you don't want visitors necessarily going on a very large loop around a federal land or public land, because if they only want to go to a specific stop, it's going to reduce their likelihood of joining that shuttle. So you need to make sure it operates efficiently and doesn't have too many stops along the way. Of course, you need to continually grow, and it requires a commitment to alternative transportation. And I think this is rather true for all types of alternative transportation. Once you start it, you have to commit to it, because you need to continually grow and adapt as demand increases, and you can change things as your needs change, as your visitors' needs change. It needs to be adaptive. And so increased congestion emissions if you have too many vehicles, especially in a shuttle system. So you need to recognize that and figure out if it's feasible or how you're going to deal with that. And then another important connection here is with shuttle systems, you need to connect to surrounding areas. And we showed that that was a great option for starting up businesses and connecting with local partners to provide funding. So it's a great option. Another challenge is having the shuttles actually hinder the experience of the natural setting by building up the shuttle system. And I personally don't think that's as serious an effect, because if you're designing this correctly and working with the right people, you should not have a huge impact on the natural setting, and you should design it to match your natural setting. However, it's a real big concern that you just need to think about and make sure that when you're designing this, you can address those issues. And kind of something I didn't think about at first is by implementing a shuttle system, you could reduce the parking revenue which you use to operate your federal lands. And at the Cape Cod National Seashore, they actually lost close to $30,000 each year when the shuttles were implemented. So you have to be careful, I guess, about how once you put this in, where you expect your funding to come from, and be realistic about how you're going to operate this as well. So in that case, you would probably want to charge to use the shuttles in order to increase that revenue. Okay, so let's talk about some general lessons learned from all of these different alternative transportation systems. And we see that there are the transportation systems that we talked about, namely the walking and biking and shuttle systems, although we did not cover today ferries or light rail systems or things like that. They should be relatively straightforward and easy to use. There's a huge amount of literature and documentation and reports supporting all of these different modes, and so that information is out there. So if you're thinking about doing this, there is prior experience that you can draw off of when you do this. In addition to the actual modes themselves, you need to consider providing amenities such as benches, kiosks, and shelters to support it. As I said, you really need to integrate this. It's not just throwing a few things out there. You need to commit to it and allow it to evolve and work with it and make it a core part of your federal land development. And once you do that, that's really what's going to help you encourage use and the experience levels of that. Additionally, alternative transportation systems should be well publicized and encourage people to use them. Knowing about them is half the battle, and so letting people know how they work and how to use them is utmost important. It's actually not really a great idea to have too large a demand for your alternative transportation system, at least up front. Once you have established it and it's evolved to the point where you can handle a large demand, like the Zion Park, then it makes sense. But don't try and get too big too soon, because waiting in lines and crowds to access the ATS really defeats the purpose, and that's not what we're going for here. We want to improve experiences, improve the natural environment, rather than detract from it just by using an additional mode. And again, alternative transportation systems should be integrated with all different modes, including cars. We can't just, in most cases, get rid of cars entirely. It's just not feasible, especially up front when you start implementing these things. So you need to make sure that it's integrated. And if you're going to implement, say, bikes and shuttles, you need to make sure that those two are compatible. So it's not just ATS and non-ATS, but you need to make sure that all ATS are compatible with each other. And finally, it's important to recognize that alternative transportation systems can't completely replace these private vehicles in many, many cases. And visitors really sometimes need levels of flexibility that's not always available with alternative transportation. Okay, so I want to say a few words on just partnerships and talking about measurements and assessments before we wrap things up. And so partnerships, there are many opportunities for this, and again, there's an extensive literature that talks about what people have done in the past and who they've worked with and where they've gotten funding that you can really draw from. So some of the most successful alternative transportation systems were implemented due to local and national partnerships. And really the partnerships are key to not only find the funding, but also drumming up that support to implement these things and get the visitors on board too. So it's important to identify partners, including the visitors. You really need the visitors as a buy-in into this in order for it to work. You need to evaluate the stakeholders, so who's really concerned. We talked about those three major concerns, the mobility, economics, and environment. So who has those concerns? Those are the stakeholders. You need to establish what your current transportation conditions are, whether they're good or need to be improved. You need to figure out what your current environmental conditions are, again, whether they're good or need to be improved. And you would like to figure out what your desired future transportation and environmental conditions are. And by using this information, and we talked about all those different planning options that you could use to evaluate this, you can then see how different types of alternative transportation systems and partnerships could be used to jump from your current transportation conditions and environmental conditions to your future ones. And so part of that is measuring and assessing the impacts. So we talked about the concerns and then the impacts that come from those concerns. And it's important to recognize that you can measure them. And we did a little bit of that with looking at the poll and those great pictures where we were showing the levels of crowding. There are other ways to measure and assess impacts, though. So there are many ways to do it. And we can do them with ride checks, where you get on a vehicle and just talk with people on the vehicle. We can do point counts, where we sit at a certain point and count vehicles, count activities, things like that, count visitors. We can do interviews. That's a great way to get at specific problems that people see and understand how visitors, that stakeholder perception, what that would be. But you can also interview not just visitors, but the local businesses, the local development around it, all the other stakeholders involved. Interviews are a great way to reach out at that. You could do further evaluation of indicators and standards of quality. And then you could do surveys, which could include onboard passenger, which, as I said, you get on board a vehicle, versus non-passenger. You could do a busy versus non-busy times of year, trying to understand the differences in what your alternative transportation system would need to accomplish in both. And finally, you can do stated versus revealed preferences, where you have record what someone says they would do versus what they actually did do. And so there's benefits to both of those. And in order to collect all this information, you really need to work with those partners, actually, and get support from federal land management agencies, the Human Subjects Review Board, federal land visitors, universities, the TAC. All these are great partners to look to for not only methods for doing these things, but also helping you actually implement them and go out and complete these studies. And together, both of you may think of things that one of them would not. And among these things, I personally believe that the visitor experience data is especially important. And it's important to collect this information on whether you agree or disagree, Likert scales, which is what you see here in the picture, like sort of a ranking between 1 and 5. We did that with the poll of how acceptable is something. And then qualitative responses, just interviews, talking with someone, getting their perceptions of things. And to use this information, it's really important. The visitor experience piece of it is very useful to request funds for the alternative transportation projects, to form collaborations and partnerships, to monitor project implementation, and to monitor those standards of quality. And this is not to say that qualitative is better than quantitative. You kind of need to form both, because you need to collect both qualitative and quantitative to support improvements and use it in the planning process. So a couple takeaway projects from this presentation. First, this is actually a critical time for federal lands. Now that we have this program out, it's to support all these alternative transportation systems. It's great for that, but at the same time, we've sort of hit our limits we have such high levels of congestion at many federal lands right now. The infrastructure is starting to fall apart, so we really need to start addressing things soon. And the funding for these things is at kind of a shift right now too. So finding those partners and going after that funding is a critical time for all of that. And we talked about many of the concerns associated with balancing the demand for federal lands and also the environmental character and quality of the visitor experience there. So that's kind of the core issue that we're addressing with alternative transportation systems, where we want people to be there and we want them to experience this, but at the same time we need to keep that environmental character and keep that experience both for today and for tomorrow. And so we have a number of different alternative transportation systems that can provide opportunities to solve those issues and those concerns that we have that are currently facing our federal lands. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it's a great opportunity to solve things. And so that being said, decisions on alternative transportation systems need to be site-specific and address your local concerns. And this is all part of that planning process that you really need to understand who's coming, what they want to do, when they're doing it, and what impacts that behavior has on your environment, and how your alternative transportation system can address both of those things. And finally, it's useful to implement planning processes to identify these things, how individuals and the environment will react to these changes. So I've talked about a number of resources here. Here's a list. I believe all of you are going to get handouts or are able to download handouts of this presentation. And so if you'd like more information, these are some great additional resources for you to look at. And here's a few more. And I'd like to, I guess, make a plug for the other training modules that are part of this whole series. We are really using this one as an introduction to the entire module series, so you can see us as number 1 there on the list. But if you'd like to learn more about the process to do this, or once you've decided, okay, we'd like to look into alternative transportation systems, what you need to do for it, there's all these different options to look at. And so some of them have been completed, and some of them are coming soon. So.
And Jeff, I'll just jump in here. We're, of course, reviewing Module 1, which is the first one on the list here. We have offered a webinar for Module 2, which is defining the needs of the ATS planning process. And we've also offered a webinar on Module 7, which is financial cost estimating. Those are available on the TAC website, and this one will be as well. And just before we leave, I will bring everybody to the TAC website so they can take a look at any past webinars, review them, and also look up some information on upcoming webinars. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And so I believe that wraps up our presentation. If there are any final questions, I would be happy to answer them. I realize this is a lot of information, a lot of talking about the concerns, issues, and transportation systems, but I hope it was useful to everyone, and good luck with all your alternative transportation system projects.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As promised, I will bring you to the TAC website, the Transit Assistance Technical Assistance website, so that you can review this on your own. You actually are on the website now, so you can maneuver around within it. I hope that you can join us for upcoming webinars. We are scheduled to have one in October. And just a reminder that if you'd like to download the PowerPoint presentation or any of the handouts that you've seen today, in the top right-hand corner of your screen is a button that reads Handouts. It's three white pieces of paper, and you can download all of Jeff's handouts there. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a fantastic day.